Okay, so let's talk about one of the most powerful and, honestly, mysterious figures in Jewish mysticism, an angel named Metatron. But what if his entire story, his very existence, is tangled up with the story of Jesus? We're about to dive into a pretty compelling theory that the angel Metatron was intentionally crafted as a direct theological rival to Jesus Christ.
So, to really get this, you have to understand the core of the conflict. Way before Christianity ever showed up on the scene, a lot of Jewish thinkers believed that God didn't rule the heavens alone. Nope. They believed there was a second throne, a second power, who was like a divine co-ruler. And this wasn't some fringe idea, this was a mainstream belief. But it left this huge, glaring question. Who gets to sit on that throne? The battle for that seat would literally change history.
All right, let's rewind the clock for a minute. In the time before the first Christians, this whole idea of a second divine figure wasn't controversial at all. It was just part of the theological furniture. Think of it less like a rivalry and more like an open job position in heaven, a vacancy, right at the top. The throne was empty, just waiting for the right candidate to come along.
And the groundwork for this second power had been laid for centuries. Go back to around 200 BC, and you have the book of Daniel talking about this mysterious Son of Man figure who's given all this cosmic power. Even earlier, in the Torah, you have the angel of Yahweh. And this isn't just some messenger. This is basically understood as God's visible form. By the time Jesus was born, you had major thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, who were openly writing about the Logos, the divine word as a second God. The stage was completely set for someone to step into this role.
So what exactly was the second power supposed to do? Well, think of them as God's chief agent, a divine vice-regent. They were the mediator who could wield God's own authority and even carry his sacred name, YHW. That's why they were sometimes called the lesser YHW. And this is the really crucial part. At the time, this wasn't heresy. It was seen as a totally valid way for an infinite, invisible God to actually interact with our physical world.
So as you can see, there were all these different titles floating around, all pulled from scripture and philosophy. But it didn't really matter what you called this being, the Son of Man, the Angel of Yahweh, the Logos. The job description was always the same, a supreme being who acts as the bridge between God and humanity. The position was created and defined. It was just waiting for someone to fill it. And then everything changed. A small group, the followers of a preacher from Galilee named Jesus, made an absolutely radical claim. They took this abstract theological job description and they said, "That's him. That's our guy." They attached it to a real person, and in doing so, they made it concrete, personal, and for the religious authorities of the day, incredibly dangerous.
This quote right here, this is basically where the gauntlet gets thrown down. Early Christians are explicitly connecting Jesus to the Son of Man from the book of Daniel and to the figure who gets to sit at God's right hand. See, they weren't inventing a new theology out of thin air. They were looking at that vacant throne in Jewish theology and boldly claiming it for Jesus. This completely shifted the game from a philosophical debate to a direct political and religious challenge.
Well, this put the rabbinic authorities in a really tough spot. They couldn't just tear the book of Daniel out of their own scriptures to get rid of the Son of Man concept. The idea was already there, in black and white. So, this theory argues, they came up with an absolutely brilliant counter-strategy. If you can't get rid of the throne, then you create your own rival king to sit on it. And they did this in 3 incredibly clever steps. Step 1, give him a new name. They called their figure Metatron, a name that isn't even Hebrew. It probably comes from Greek or Latin. This immediately put some distance between him and the traditional Hebrew titles that Christians were now applying to Jesus. Step 2, give him a human origin. Metatron wasn't some pre-existent divine being. No, he was Enoch, the guy from Genesis who was so righteous that God just took him up to heaven. And finally, step 3, a very clear demotion. They created a story to make sure everybody knew, without a doubt, who was really in charge. Now, to give their new candidate some serious street cred, the rabbis took scriptures that were originally about the angel of YHW and said, see, these are actually about Metatron. This verse from Exodus was the linchpin, because saying, my name is in him, meant Metatron could carry God's own name, YHW. This effectively gave him the credentials of the lesser YHW and solidified his status as the real second power. And then came the masterstroke. There's this story in the Talmud, a central text of rabbinic Judaism, about a high-ranking rabbi who mystically ascends to heaven. He sees Metatron sitting on a throne and mistakenly shouts, "There are 2 powers in heaven."
For this apparent confusion, Metatron is dragged out and publicly whipped with 60 lashes of fire. The message could not possibly be clearer. No matter how high and mighty this guy is, he is a servant. He is not a god. Do not worship him.
So, this all brings us to the climax of this incredible theological drama. When you actually put Jesus and Metatron side by side, the parallels are just uncanny. According to this analysis, they're not just similar. They are a near-perfect mirror image of each other, suggesting a very deliberate construction of a rival figure.
The similarities in their job descriptions, their roles, their titles, their functions in the heavenly court, are so specific and so striking that this analysis argues it just can't be a coincidence. Metatron seems to have been meticulously crafted as a kind of shadow Jesus, a figure designed to fill the exact same theological space, but with one critical, game-changing difference.
Okay, let's just break this down. Look at this. They both bear God's name. They both sit on a heavenly throne. They both act as the chief mediator and heavenly high priest. But for every single parallel, there's a carefully constructed counterpoint. Jesus is the pre-existent son. Metatron is a promoted human, a servant. Jesus sits at God's right hand. Metatron sits by the door. Jesus' crucifixion is seen as redemptive, saving humanity. Metatron's lashing is just a punishment to put him in his place. It's like they're perfect opposites.
And this leads us to the single most important difference, what you could call the theological firewall between the two. It's all about the direction of travel. Christianity is fundamentally about incarnation, God moving down to become human. The Metatron story is the exact opposite. It's about exaltation, a human moving up to become angelic. One is a story of divine descent, the other is human ascent. It creates a fundamental, unbridgeable gap. It's the anti-incarnation.
So what was the end game here? Why go to all of this trouble? Well, this rabbinic countermove wasn't just some short-term fix. According to this analysis, it was a breathtakingly successful long-term strategy that not only neutralized the Christian claim, but ended up fundamentally reshaping the future of both Judaism and Christianity.
The strategy was basically twofold. First, containment. Metatron became this perfect theological container for all those tricky Bible verses. So now, when a Christian missionary points to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, the rabbis have a ready answer. Oh, you mean Metatron? Yeah, he's our heavenly scribe, our highest angel, not God. Second, immunization. That story of Metatron being whipped, it acted like a theological vaccine, protecting the Jewish community from the heresy of worshiping any second divine power.
And the ultimate result was a massive theological shift. Judaism, which, as we've seen, was once pretty comfortable with a kind of binarian theology, the idea of two powers in heaven, now had to draw a very hard line in the sand. To create a crystal-clear distinction from the emerging Christian faith, Rabbinic Judaism doubled down on a strictly Unitarian monotheism, where God is absolutely and indivisibly one.
So the great irony in all of this is that the two powers theology wasn't some strange foreign idea that Christians invented. It was a native biblical concept that grew right out of Jewish scripture. In the end, it just became a casualty of war, caught in the theological crossfire between two New World religions who were desperately trying to define themselves against one another. And that leaves us with a final massive question. Is this enigmatic figure, Metatron, the celestial scribe, actually the most enduring proof of a theological idea so powerful, so embedded in the Bible that it couldn't simply be erased? An idea that, when faced with the ultimate challenge of Christianity, had to be captured, contained, and completely rebranded to defend the theological borders of a faith. It's a fascinating and powerful look at how rivalry doesn't just create conflict, but can actually shape the very essence of religion itself.